Welcome back. We are still talking about global governance. This is screencast 4 of the political realities of globalization and contextualization part 2. We've been looking at some of what Dodgson, Lee, and Dagger have said about international versus global governance, looking specifically at education issues rather than health issues. But we talked in the last screencast about how we were making that difference make sense. And if we go on, and again, I'm replacing their emphasis on health with education. I explained why I think that that is an appropriate adjustment to make, although there are significant differences in the education and health arenas. But let's move forward. So on page 279, Dodgson, Lee, and Dagger say that globalization has contributed to a decline in both the political and practical capacity of the national governments acting alone or in cooperation with other states to deal with the global education challenges. Now, this is an interesting point. If globalization, and they are defining globalization as a growth in the number and degree of influence of non-state actors in this governance, if that has contributed to a decline in both the political and practical capacity of the national governments, that means that non-state actors are actually pulling the political and practical capacity of national governments away. Okay, so how does this come about? Well, one, it can be a deterritorialization of how we think about and promote education, and thus the need to address factors which cross and even ignore the geographical boundaries of the state, which undermines the capacity of states to control cross-border activity. The idea of this deterritorialization is that political boundaries no longer make as much sense because the ways that these education challenges are being met or addressed are ways that cross or ignore geographical boundaries or political boundaries of nation states. Secondly, there's a need to define and address the determinants of education from a multi-sectoral perspective, which means that there's a danger of casting the education net so widely that everything becomes subsumed within the global education umbrella. Now, this need to define and address the determinants of education in this case from a multi-sectoral perspective suggests that politics, economy, social issues, any sector you can think of. I don't know why I'm blanking on anything past those three, but any sector you can think of will need or necessarily be a part of this globalization, this non-state actor influence on national government capacity. And that the danger then is that as we globalize or we address education from all of these sectoral perspectives, that education will be cast so widely that everything has to be subsumed under the global education umbrella instead of left to national or state actors to deal with. Thirdly, there is a need, they say, to involve, both formally and informally, a broader range of actors and interests. And they say that the difference for global education governance lies in their degree of involvement and the nature of their respective roles varying with the education issue concerned. So, in one way we could sort of sum this up as saying that it's all a complexity issue. That as more sectors become involved in educational governance, as more non-state influence is a part of how states govern their education system, and as more actors and interests become fundamentally involved in the educational challenges facing most national governments, that globalization will continue to suck away the political and practical capacity of national governments to deal with their own educational challenges. All right, bleak picture being painted here, so warning. So maybe we need to reflect a little bit. Maybe we need to take a moment and say, all right, first of all, what are the items in this week's readings and discussion? Right? What are we actually looking at? And then if we take all of these items together, what do they tell us about the issues in global governance? For example, about the role of states, or the collective capacity to address cross-border problems, or possible steps toward or in resistance to world government. We should reflect on those things. So when we get to a point where we are painting ourselves into this sort of logical whole where globalization is nothing but a way to implement the decline of national governments, we have to take a step back and say there is much that is valid about this argument, and there is a lot of evidence to support it. And I think that even though we're adopting a health perspective from Dodson, Lee, and Dagger, this applies with equal veracity to an education perspective or an education environment. And so the need for reflection, the need for us to take all of these items together and say then, where is the role of the state? What evidence do we see for the role of the state as opposed to evidence about the decline of the role of the state? Where is evidence that the combination of supranational and national, or non-state and state, where do we see these elements intersecting? Because I want to encourage us to do these reflections, because otherwise we become a sort of a blinded, one-track solution. Or solution is not the right word. We become too focused on just one outcome, and we don't allow for the possibility of several different outcomes, of which there is also evidence. I guess that's where I'm trying to go. We don't want to restrict ourselves. We don't want to put blinders on and say, everything is going to hell in a handbasket. It's all the fault of globalization because globalization sucks away, political and practical capacity from state actors, blah, blah, blah. Right. So that's my personal perspective and my scholarly perspective on how we need to be careful and how we need to continue to reflect. Oops. Okay. Oops. Back. All right. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pull up another slide. Hold on. Hey, folks, welcome back. So where I meant to be going, and sorry that last part ended so abruptly, was that this leads us to reflect on a couple of different things. And one of the alternative ways to think about where globalization and contextualization are taking us in terms of educational issues and educational development and the role of state and non-state actors is to bust out of the politics for a little bit and think about the idea of culture and how culture influences what's happening both at the local level, the state level, and the global level. And to understand that there are various kinds of culture that we can address. And this is one of the reasons why we've been reading alongside our globalization reader and those sorts of things, the David Baker book, because there's a large cultural argument that's embedded in that. Whether you agree with it or not, is whichever one perspective you want to take is fine. But the point is that we have to address culture. And so we're going to begin thinking about that. And then moving into our week 11 readings and our week 11 discussion, I want you to start thinking about what is world culture and why do we care, as you see right at the top of this slide. Okay, I will see you on the discussion board. I will see you in class, and I hope that you're having a great week.